Hey everyone, welcome to the Building Excellence podcast. Today I have a special guest, Randy Alcorn. Randy, thank you so much for being here.
You bet. It's a pleasure to be with you, Bailey.
Yeah, well, kind of before we go and dive into your story and what you're currently doing, would you mind just taking us back a little bit and hearing a little bit of what life was like growing up for you? Because if I heard correctly, it wasn't like you grew up in ministry and that's always something you wanted to do. So,
Right. My dad was a tavern owner and probably the most hostile person to the gospel that I ever knew. He ultimately, fast forward at age 85, when it looked like he was dying of cancer, and he ultimately did die of cancer. I shared the gospel with him, what I thought was one last time. And he miraculously, of course, being born again is always a miracle, but he came to faith in Christ. And so that was amazing. But when I was growing up, I came to faith in Christ as a 15-year-old, and it was extremely disappointing to him because I had become religious, supposedly, and I was going to church of all things, and he thought that was pretty stupid, and he had always had high hopes for me, but the hopes were dashed because I became a Christian, and then of all things, instead of going to university, I went to Bible college and then seminary. And so in every possible way, I was a disappointment to an atheist slash agnostic father who was a tavern owner. And part of that was being very sensitive to the feelings of Christians toward drinking, which, by the way, have changed somewhat since I was young, because it was like back then, Christians didn't drink unless you were in a mainline denomination, but evangelical Christians didn't drink. Now, many evangelical Christians do drink. And I'm actually in a group of guys that meets on Sunday night, that after my wife, Nanci, went home to be with the Lord 3 years ago, they invited me to come to their group and be part of it. And I'd mentored several of those guys, and other guys had close relationships with, and a few of them just meeting then. But this group is a whiskey group. So the guy who brings the bottle, and so every eighth week, there's 8 of us. So I bring a bottle, and I had to learn what's a good whiskey and what is not. And I still don't really know. It's been 3 years, but Nanci and I would drink wine, and we would have a mixed drink sometimes or whatever. But this is the straight stuff. And so that's been a learning curve, but what a strange thing to have a learning curve in a small group of deeply committed Christian brothers. And the feature is who brings the whiskey and then asks the question. So yeah, things have changed, but growing up with the son of a tavern owner, it was a very huge challenge for my faith when I came to faith in Christ. And then I had the privilege of leading my mom to the Lord a couple of years after I came to faith in Christ. So that would have been my senior year of high school. So that was exciting. Once again, that was hard on my dad, but ultimately, like I said, he came to the Lord.
Yeah, and maybe talk a little bit about what was it like for you? You talked about the background of having, your dad being like that and your mom not necessarily knowing Jesus until you led her to. What was it like for you, and what did faith mean to you, and how did it become real to where it was your own, so that when you did have deterrence from your parent or your father, it didn't push you out like, this isn't real to me. It actually made sense to you. What was that, and why?
Well, I think the adversity was part of what helped me grow, because I was either going to follow Christ or I wasn't. Now, he radically changed my life. I mean, from the inside out, to the point that it was one of those conversions that a lot of people some people have experienced and some people have seen, where I'm in this church group and I go from being an unbeliever to the most serious person about Christ in the group, and everybody else was raised in a Christian home. So it was a little uncomfortable for me and for them, probably more so for them. because I was kind of challenging. Oh, wait a minute. Well, why aren't we sharing our faith more? And why aren't we reading the Bible more? And why aren't we, following Jesus more closely? In other words, it was I went from no faith to being a pretty radical young Christian. Part of what comes with that is being a bit overzealous sometimes and not really knowing how best to raise questions,
Okay.
with the group. And so I think I know I alienated myself from some of the kids. My the girl that I started dating, and that's why I went to church in the first place as a freshman in high school, but then came to Christ as a sophomore in high school at age 15. Um, she grew up in a Christian home. She was in that group. She's the reason I was even coming to that group. And then when I became a youth pastor, um, of course, I had to explain to everybody, I'm telling you, don't be unequally yoked, even in a dating relationship, even though Nanci and I were.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yes, that's how I came to Christ. But God can use anything. It doesn't make the thing right that he uses. But anyway, so so that's what it was like for me. Tough being at home with my dad, being the way he was. My mom's conversion was wonderful, but once again, it became almost like my dad and to a certain extent my brother versus Nanci and me. Because they weren't believers and we were. Sorry, my mom, Lucille,
Yeah.
and me. And then Nanci was in the picture also as the girl I was dating. And so that adversity actually paid off in terms of, am I serious or not? And I
Hmm.
was, and by God's grace, he sustained me.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you just pointed out, and I think your story of the adversity makes you stronger and it makes it more real. Like you have to make sure that's something that's
Right.
important to you, right? So, kind of diving into a little bit of, you talked about faith became a part of you in high school. Were you playing sports? Because I know there's a little coaching background in you, but were you playing sports in high school and some of the
Yes,
things that you were?
initially, early high school, I played football, basketball. Then I switched over to tennis um, and had a real love for tennis, and then ultimately um, played tennis in college, and then also have coached tennis numbers of years since then. There was a period of 7 years in the early 2000s where I coached our local high school team. I was assistant coach to a friend who was the head coach. And then I came out of retiring from tennis coaching to doing it again when my grandsons were both playing tennis at the same high school I went to and the same high school my daughters went to,
Hmm.
both of them. And so, uh, yeah, so definitely sports in my background. And sports are part of my life now in a different way. Now that I've retired from tennis again, but for the last 10 years, I've spoken for pro athletes outreach at their NFL conference every year. So I've gotten to know a number of those guys in the NFL who are believers, some who have come to Christ through that conference and been able to a certain extent, mentor some of them. So have close friendships with some pro athletes and have also spoken at their MLB conference one year, and then gotten to know some of their Major League Baseball people who have come to the NFL conference. And that happens sometimes. They've attempted to establish it in the NBA. It's been more difficult in the NBA because of the smaller numbers. I think that's a
Hmm.
big part of it, of people, because there's so many people on a football team,
Sure.
and so many people on a baseball team, and the baseball season is so long. You just have so many people uh, in those markets, and not as many players in the NBA. But one of the chaplains, I won't say for what team, but is working right now. trying to put together something for the NBA, and we'll pray that this time it'll be successful. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you've always had some type of affiliation to sports, obviously
Right.
coaching, playing, and then just being involved in general.
Mm-hmm.
What did it look like to go to college, play college tennis, go to Bible school, and then did you know you wanted to get into ministry right off the bat?
I did. When I first went to Bible college, I thought I was probably going to end up being a missionary. Sold out to Jesus, reading all the missionary books back in the day, the five guys who were killed by the Auca Indians in Ecuador, Jim Elliot and Nate Saint among them, kind of role models for me. Not that I wanted to die for my faith, but I was willing to die for my faith, and I admired them, read some of the books that were popular back in that day, that some people would remember or be aware of, but a lot of people wouldn't now. But God's Smuggler, Tortured for Christ, Richard Wurmbrand, radical books, that appealed to my radical newfound faith in Christ. But then had a man who was my youth pastor, Stu Weber, who some people will recognize his name. He did a lot of speaking for Promise Keepers back in the 90s, wrote a very popular men's book called Tender Warrior, related to husbands. And Stu and I remain great friends to this day. But I am next month turning 71 and he's turning 80. And when we started the church, he was 32 and I was 21.
Okay.
So no, actually, I turned 22 just a month after the church started. So here I was as a full-time pastor at age 22, and he was by that time 31, and then it was like we started this church and we kind of didn't know what we were doing. He knew more what he was doing than I did, but he too he'd grown up in a Christian home, but he came back to his faith while he was in Vietnam, and then became youth pastor. We became friends, and so we were asked to start a church basically, and we did, and that was great fun. It was an adventure, tons of hard work. So I went from thinking probably going to be a missionary to becoming a pastor. Nanci and I by then were married as I was going through seminary, and it was great times. But in terms of how I knew that God had called me to ministry, it was more circumstantial than anything else. It was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm serious about serving the Lord. I'm studying the Word. I'm teaching. I had a junior high group, then I had a high school group, then I had a college group, and then we started the church. And I was preaching half the time, and it was like, before I knew it, I was a pastor, and a very young pastor.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of lessons within that. But one thing that I'd love to share, were you always seeking out people ahead of you to learn from and having mentors? You talked about reading books and things like that, but what was that like for you? Were you always kind of like that?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly look to older people in the church. In some ways, and it's almost strange to say it, but I felt like I was mentored by C.S. Lewis, Francis Schaeffer, and A.W. Tozer, because their books, and there are a lot of them between the three of them, uh, it's like I knew them. Like their words spoke to me. I read everything that they wrote, and Francis Schaeffer was current at the time. A.W. Tozer and C.S. Lewis had passed away years earlier, but to me, everything I read by them was fresh. I'll never forget going to a local bookstore, that somebody had converted their garage into a Christian bookstore and had all these titles, large numbers of titles. Everything was spine out. You never saw a cover, so you're just going through and alphabetically with the authors. I'll never forget, I came to this one called The Problem of Pain, C.S. Lewis. And so I read The Problem of Pain, and I was so impressed with this guy who'd been an agnostic, atheist, and actually uses some of his own arguments and answers some of his old arguments he made as an unbeliever, about could a good God allow the suffering and the pain. And Lewis had changed his perspective on that, but he was fresh with all the arguments. So it was like apologetics to me, and Francis Schaeffer, philosophical level apologetics and his writings. Um, and, uh, they in particular, but A.W. Tozer, who is radical in his own walk with Christ and his own beliefs, a very imperfect person. Actually, all three of those were imperfect people, and so are we all.
Sure.
But I felt like they mentored me probably more even than my youth pastor did. Although when he and I started the church together, he definitely became more and more of a mentor. And even as he led the youth group, he would learn something at seminary, and he would come in and he said, okay, this morning, here's what I learned in this class. It's not that he didn't prepare, but he was very busy and he had 3 kids, and this was a part-time job for him. And he's in seminary. And so he would mentor me through what he had learned sometimes that very day, and certainly within the last few weeks at seminary. So I felt like I was going through seminary with him. I was in Bible college and then seminary myself. We went to the same seminary, but we weren't in any classes together. But yeah, so he certainly became a mentor to me, as did these writers. That's what drew me, I think, part of what drew me into writing. I saw what impact they made on my life, and I wanted to make impact on other people's life.
Yeah, and I think that's the question I was thinking of as you're sharing that, because obviously you didn't get a chance to meet a couple of those who had already passed, but their influence within their work of writing
Yes.
was something that obviously influenced you and you wanted to do. So was that something, when did you start writing, and when did that become something that you consistently did on a daily basis? Because you've written a lot of books, so it started from a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it's, I've forgotten which, but it's either 62 or 63 books. And I'm actually turning in a book probably next week. So that'll be 63 or 64, wherever I am now. Some of them are out of print now, but most of them are still in print and still selling well. Yeah, so with writing, I'll never forget, speaking of mentors or people having an influence on you. I had my favorite theology prof at Bible college was named Joseph Wong. And Dr. Wong, who I just loved as a person, one of the things I loved about him was he really knew his theology, and he was also very funny. And sense of humor has always been important to me in life and ministry. So to have an accomplished theology prof who was also very humorous, and he'd tell a story, or somebody would raise their hand. And I remember one time, one guy was like in the front row, and he's always wanted to be called on. And he literally, the student grabbed the overhead projector that Dr. Wong was using, that will date this, overhead projector. Look it up on the internet if you don't know what an overhead projector was. But anyway, so he grabs this, and I remember Dr. Wong instantly says, take your hand off it, lest I slay thee between the horns of the altar. And it was like, where did that come from? But he would just do kind of wacky biblical allusions like that, and also make a point to this student: just back off, guy, and let other people ask questions, and don't keep waving your hand, And he could have just talked to him about it, but from that point forward, he was no longer waving his hand in the front row, or not even sitting in the front row, because I think Dr. Wong scared him. But anyway, so Joe Wong, great guy. And one of my, it was actually a term paper in a theology class that I turned in. He wrote on the top of it, Randy, this is excellent work. You should consider becoming a writer. So when somebody you really respect says you should consider becoming a writer, I had no plans to become a writer, I had an interest in writing. I didn't think I'd ever be like a full-time writer, which is essentially what I've been for a number of years now. I also direct a ministry, but God called me out of pastoral ministry through some interesting circumstances related to the pro-life movement, standing in front of abortion clinics and peaceful nonviolent civil disobedience, the rescue movement. So a lawsuit was brought against me and others, and I actually resigned from being a pastor because they were coming to the church to garnish my wages, and I couldn't allow the church to be in that position. So I stepped out of ministry, and now I was like, what should I do next? And started a parachurch ministry called Eternal Perspective Ministries. But anyway, but part of my job description then was writing. That was like, that's what I'm supposed to do, as well as speaking and directing the ministry. We decided to give all my royalties from my books to different parachurch groups and missions, pro-life work, and all of that. One of the best decisions we ever made. And God has blessed those books. And I think part of the reason maybe why they've sold over 12 million copies is because all the royalties go to God's kingdom. I hope that they're good books in and of themselves. But beyond that, I think God blessed them maybe for those reasons.
Mm-hmm. And they are good books, but also too, I love how you talked about that person saying that you had a talent towards writing. And so honing into those things, and then obviously the rest is history, the impact that you made through your books, just like C.S. Lewis and those guys made on you, you've been able to make an influence upon so many people, including myself, like I told you before.
And let me add too that Francis Schaeffer, who was the only one of those three primary writers that really influenced me, Lewis and Tozer being the others, I wrote a letter to Francis Schaeffer about the impact of his books on me, and he sent me back a handwritten, several-page letter. And I thought, this is incredible, because to say the least, he was a busy person and heading up L'Abri, doing his writing, speaking, everything involved in his life. And that made an impact on me. And I get many, many letters from people, as some writers do. And I'm tempted sometimes to not be able to answer them. Now, I don't answer everything, but I always have someone on our staff answer on my behalf. I always read whatever anyone says, and I'll sometimes delegate it and say, hey, would you tell them thanks for that letter, and then just say and try to answer their question. And I have a policy of I'll answer every question or any question one time, but I don't want to keep repeating. So now you can take my answer and then embellish and add your answer around my answer or whatever, but let's reuse this thing and get a lot of traction out of it. But I feel strongly about responding to people. Now, when it's a young person, I will always personally answer their letter.
Why is that?
I think because when I was a young person, Francis Schaeffer had time for me.
I love that. I love the answer. I think that's a great point.
And C.S. Lewis, though he was home with the Lord by the time I came to faith in Christ, he died in 1963, the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I was only in third grade then. But as a 15-year-old, probably I wrote to Schaeffer maybe as a 17-year-old, 16, 17. But Lewis has whole collections of letters of C.S. Lewis. He wrote back to people as often as he possibly could, and he almost always answered people, and that has been a great example to me. Also, just generally, it's been an example to me in ministry to have time for people. When I go to church, sometimes I'll be very honest, and I've told the pastors this, because I still go to the same church where I used to be a pastor, which is positive in one way, negative in another way, because some people will always think of me as their pastor, because I used to be a pastor. But I haven't actually been a pastor since I resigned in 1990, and we started the church in 1977. So we're at 48 years since we started that church.
That's
And it's the
awesome.
same church I've been going to. Only been in two churches in my life. The one where I came to Christ, and then the church that Stu and I started together. But what's tough sometimes is that people, I go to church on Saturday night. And part of my reason for going to church on Saturday night is because I don't want to be at church on Sundays because there's so many people.
Uh-huh.
And so fewer people on Saturday nights. But then I'll get people who want to talk to me about my books and want to go out to coffee together and want to, and I don't ever want to say no, but sometimes I have to say no.
Sure.
And it made it challenging. Now, my wife, Nanci, when she became sick with cancer, um, uh, I would stay home with her and we would watch, church online. And part of that was during the COVID years.
Yeah.
And so lots of people were watching online, but her cancer moved from her colon to her lungs. Hence, of all times to have cancer in your lungs during COVID, then the risk was not as great for other people as a lot of people thought. But the risk for Nanci would have been huge because a third of her lungs had been removed surgically to deal with the cancer. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you touched on, I love the tremendous impact that you can have an imprint on somebody by just responding. And
right,
obviously there's levels to that, but just being willing to do that makes a tremendous imprint upon
yeah,
people. Kind of going back in your story, you talked about how Eternal Perspective Ministry started. I'd love for you to share. You've written so many books, and I told you before, Money, Possessions, and Eternity is a book that I read. I think you wrote early on. I think in
I did.
'89
It
is when
came
it
out
came
in
out.
1989, the original edition, and then I did an update on it in the 2000s. But yeah,
Yes, and not to date us, but I think that book came out before I was born,
right,
and it's made a tremendous impact on me. And you had no, I mean, I wasn't even born yet, so I
yeah,
think that's a great, just the way books can work
right.
and words can work. But I love to go into that a little bit, talking about biblical stewardship and what that looks like, and your thoughts on that because you've written so many great books and the treasure principle. Maybe share a little bit about why that's important and how to go effectively doing that on a daily basis for people.
Yeah, I just very recently spoke at the 25th anniversary of the Generous Giving organization and their annual conference they put on. And I'll never forget when they started that ministry. Four guys contacted me and said, each of us read your book, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, and it was in the 90s, so it would have been the 1989 version, and it changed each of our lives. And so we decided we want to start a group called Generous Giving, which has now expanded and is really all over the world. But I remember that first conference speaking at it, and Ron Blue and I were the two speakers the first 2 years of that conference. And then I think there was maybe 50 the first year, maybe there was 80 the second year, maybe it was close to 100. But now here we were, and 800 people at this conference and being high impact. And they have these journey of just generosity things that they put on all over the place. But really a privilege to be the old guy that's there with younger guys. And when I say younger guys, they're not that young anymore.
Yeah.
When they started, they were like in 20s and 30s. But like me, they've gotten much older. And so they're passing the baton, some of them, on to others. But yeah, stewardship, huge role in my life. Money, Possessions, Eternity, ironically, it was just after Money, Possessions, and Eternity came out that I had to resign as a pastor. It was within a year of it coming out. So it came out in 89, spring of 89, and then spring of 90 is when I had to resign as a pastor to keep the wages that were being garnished from my church, to keep them from going to an abortion clinic. So stewardship immediately became a real issue in my life because part of the reason, the largest part of the reason we decided to give away all the royalties from my book were because they were going to be garnished and go to an abortion clinic, and there was no way we could stop it. So I could stop being a pastor, but I had written these books, so what I needed to do was to sign those royalties over to our new ministry that we started, Eternal Perspective Ministries, and then we would give away 100% of those royalties. Now, since that time, the board said at one point, hey, since we are a ministry, how would you feel about keeping 10% of it for our ministry? So give that 10%. So it all still goes to ministry 100%, but 10% of it goes to our ministry. And that's what we did years ago. And God used that to provide for our ministry as well. But yeah, so the giving part of stewardship was huge, but also the managing money, budgeting, not so much budgeting as just being extremely careful, which is part of budgeting, but with our money, because I could only make minimum wage, because anything beyond minimum wage would be garnishable. So our ministry paid me just minimum wage. And now I could have, my thought was I can no longer be a pastor. I guess I could have been a pastor at minimum wage, and that would have been very popular with a number of churches. That there were churches at the time that didn't pay much more than minimum wage for their pastors anyway. But this then, we had to be very careful. Now, the ministry paid my wife Nanci part-time for the work she did, and she was able to make a normal wage, but that was part-time because we were having kids, or we already had kids, and we didn't want her to work full-time. But the stewardship aspects, no sooner did money, possessions, and eternity come out than I was immediately facing the financial challenges of realizing that I could be in a position where they would garnish my wages and I might have to give up the royalties from the books, which I did, but more significantly, had to resign from the church in the spring of 1990s. So 1 year after that book came out, I was making minimum wage. So that was a challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, there's tremendous challenge in that. Obviously, stepping away from ministry, starting your own, but also living off minimum wage, your family, you have young kids. But at the same time, there's a concept, and it's basically goes into everything you've talked about God owns everything.
Right.
And how did that ability to trust and understand that concept, and how is that so important for people to understand, and why?
Well, that whole thing and the number of scripture passages that, not only he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and but in Leviticus where it says the silver and the gold are mine, says the Lord. Everything belongs to him. The earth and everything in it, one of the Psalms says, belongs to him. His ownership is the key to our stewardship, because a steward is not an owner. By definition, a steward manages, and in some cases, part of the management is giving it away, manages what belongs to someone else. It belongs to God. And because it belongs to God, we don't have the right to do whatever we want to with it. And it's like a professional money manager. And I work with a lot of people. I don't have a professional money manager. I mean, I do have somebody who oversees the mutual funds or whatever. And so that would be kind of a sort of a money manager, but he's not in my direct employment like some of the professional athletes that I, work with. They literally have their own money manager. So an analogy that I've used is, suppose one of those guys, said, "Hey, wait a minute. I see my my bank account balance is now zero. So what happened to all that money? And then imagine if they said, well, uh, actually, I don't really know. Or even, well, I gave that money to my children. And I go, wait a minute, that was not your money. You just embezzled this. You're a money manager. You're not the owner of the money. So in some areas, it should be obvious to us the difference between being a steward and an owner. But too often it's like, oh, stewardship, that means I give away 10% of my money. Well, first of all, it's not your money. It belongs to God. And secondly, it's not 10% that belongs to God. It's 100%. So now you have to figure out, how much am I going to allot to myself of God's money to live on? Of course, we all have to live on something, right? So it's
Sure.
fine that we live on some of it. But if we are, for instance, making very large wages, like the pro athletes and some of the business people that are my good friends that are very successful, and some of them are giving away, especially those business professionals, they're giving away 90% plus of their income. In some cases, it's literally more than that. If you know anything about like David Green and Hobby Lobby and
Hmm.
all of that, they give away 50% of their profits on what they sell in their stores goes to God's kingdom. But then they also give away a huge percentage of what of the company, and the children are not going to walk away with huge inheritances, and my children are their inheritance from me, even if I kept the book or royalties, which I don't, would not be anything like it would be a major company. But they know that they God is going to provide for them. That's what I told them years ago. I'll give you your mom and I, and of course Nanci's now with the Lord, but we'll give you a small amount, but not enough that it could ruin your life. Not enough that it could tempt you to, okay, buy a second house. Not that I'm saying it's always wrong to have a second house or a vacation place or whatever, but not to pay for high budget vacations or whatever, but give you enough. Certainly will help the kids through college. I'm doing that now. 3 grandsons in college, helping out each of them. Um, but don't want to give you money that is actually God's money that God has entrusted to us. So we will support you and we'll be very generous with you while I'm still alive, and we will leave you something. But the majority of it, in fact, none of the royalties are going to go to my children, my grandchildren. They'll never see that money. But just recently, I do this periodically, but call on them to give away. Uh, each of them, a royalty check came in for $110,000 from one of my publishers, and said to our staff and to our kids and our grandkids, each of you gets $5,000. You don't get it, you get to give it away.
Hmm.
And so here are some recommendations, some alternatives. You can come up with your own, and we'll give it away on your behalf and all of that.
Yeah, but as you said, stewarding it because it's God's money, not your own, as a steward
Exactly.
is key. But also too, when you prosper to give, not to gain. And I think that's a great
Right.
perspective as well because it's for eternal purposes. And maybe share about the two different ideas of the natural world of which we live in versus the eternal, and building wealth in that kingdom as opposed to where we are today.
Yeah, I have a little book called The Treasure Principle, which has been really my best selling book. And then after that would be my book on heaven. But even those relate, because Jesus says, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures where? In heaven, which is where you're going to live forever. And in the heaven book and some of my other books on heaven, I clarify that's not a disembodied state. That's going to be the eternal heaven, will be on the new earth. So look around you on the earth to get an idea of what the new earth will be like. Just subtract the curse from that, from what you see around you. The curse that causes suffering, that causes death, that results in grief and loss and all the sin that is in the world. That came as a result of the fall. The curse came as a result of the fall. And so the world we live in now is not the normal world. We think of as normal because it's, well, that's where we live, but it's actually an aberration from God's perfect Eden. And then there's going to be the new earth, that the book ends in Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22 on two different ends of the spectrum. Everything that is in between those is the era that we live in now. And so we live under the curse, but God is going to take away the curse. But meantime, Jesus says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And it's very interesting because his logic in Matthew 6, where he says this, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. His logic is, he doesn't say, because that's the unspiritual thing to do. What he says is, moth and rust corrupt, thieves break in and steal. I mean, fire burns it. You can't, hold on to it. It's going to disappear. Either you will be separated from your treasures, or your treasures on earth will be separated from you. So his logic isn't, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth because it's unspiritual. His logic is, because that's the stupid thing to do, because you can't hold on to them. You're going to lose them one way or another. So it doesn't mean don't have any money and don't spend any money. It means don't make primarily the accumulation of material goods on earth what you are about. Instead, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not corrupt, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So now this becomes extremely significant, because it tells us how to move our hearts from where they are to where they should be. So if you want a heart for the kingdom of God, Jesus tells you very clearly how to do that. Don't hang on to it, give it away. When you give away, you have changed what your life is most invested in. The more you give, the more you are investing in eternity. You're laying up treasures for yourself in heaven, which is the same thing as saying developing vested interest in heaven rather than on earth. And I think this is where people get so messed up, because where your treasures are, there your heart will be also. Well, where are your treasures? Well, the vast majority of people, even if they give away 10%, which we think is like a big deal, and it's actually was one of 3 tithes that was required of the poorest Israelite. Now, one of their tithes was more like our taxes, because it was a theocracy, it was under government. But then there were 2 other tithes, and the one tithe was every 3rd year, the poor tithe. But in any case, a minimum of 13 to 15 to 17%, whatever, of their income was being given to the Lord, and it was required of everyone. Some people argue against this. What I say is, look, I'm not a legalist. Do I believe God requires us to give the tithe? No, I don't. What I do believe is you're going to have a hard time at the judgment seat of Christ, standing before the Lord and explaining how it is that you lived in the wealthiest country, by and large, the wealthiest country in human history. And in your lifetime, all this money came in, and you gave away as a maximum what was a minimum for the poorest Israelite to give away, not only in an economy that wasn't nearly as wealthy as our own, but where they didn't have the indwelling Spirit of God in their lives. And they didn't have all the teachings or any of the teachings of Jesus in their lives. And you, at the judgment seat of Christ, when you give an account of your stewardship, are going to have to explain why you gave only the most basic thing that was required of them. Well, now I'm talking about people who actually do give 10%, and the vast majority of people don't. So I'm just saying, now, I'm not a legalist. It's not required of you that you do it. But you're just going to have to say, seriously, I'm going to give less than God required of them to give?
But also, too, it goes into the fact, I've heard you touch on it before, but not only does he just want, your heart, but he wants to be a friend with you. And at the
Yes,
same time, when you have that relationship, you do it out of a desire because you have a relationship of want to. And it
exactly.
goes back to the kind of the treasure idea of giving it away.
Yeah,
Because the more
in
you
John
give,
15, no longer do I call you servants, I call you friends. Now, he still does call us servants, but his point is, you are my friends as well. And the owner, when he shares with the steward his plans and his agenda, he's inviting us voluntarily to come into that relationship of friendship with him. And there's really no greater privilege. And I would say in the 3 years since Nanci um, went home to be with the Lord, the friendship of Jesus has meant more to me. It meant a lot to me before. Nanci and I would talk about it a lot. But now it means more to me than it has ever meant to me, because my second best friend, Nanci, went to be with my first best friend, Jesus, and her best friend. And so one day we'll be reunited as second best friends, but neither of us has been separated from one moment from our best friend, Jesus.
That's well said. And I think I'd love to kind of tie into that a little bit. You wrote a book called If God is Good. And I've heard you share about your experiences, after Nanci's passed, and just in the midst of trials and turmoil, how our faith grows and how our relationships can even deepen. If you wouldn't mind, share how, even in the midst of that challenging time in your life, your faith grew and your love for Jesus got even more real, even though it probably at the time didn't realize it could, but it just keeps getting deeper and deeper.
Yeah, just God in adversity. Alluded to this before, of my father's hostility toward the gospel early on, with me, and other challenges. Adversity brings out things in you. But the greatest adversity, by far, that I have ever experienced, I mean, my best friend died, my mom died. There's been just definite challenges, but Nanci's 4 years of cancer and ultimately her death from cancer were the biggest challenge. But God was there for her and for me. And the most important part of that is he was there for her. And him being there for her was the same as being there for me, because she's the love of my life, other than Jesus himself. And to see God work in such dramatic and powerful ways in her life as she was getting weaker and weaker. And again, a third of her lungs taken away in 3 different surgeries, um, uh, uh, 4 times going through long um, treatments with chemotherapy, 3 different series of treatments, 3 different regimens of radiation, and all of that taking such a toll on her. But her spirit was soaring. She was so dependent on the Lord. Every day, I get up. She's writing in her journal, and then after a while, I asked, "Could I see some of what you're writing?" And she let me see it. And oh my word, the things that she would say, her dependence on the Lord. I remember one morning she showed me something she had written. She had been reading in um, Psalm 119, which is 176 verses or something like that. And one of those verses said, all things are God's servant. And so what she wrote that day was, this means that my cancer is God's servant in my life and in the lives of others.
Hmm.
And my prayer is that he will use this for his glory and use me for his glory. But she is looking at cancer as God's servant in her life. And
Hmm.
she would come up with insights like that all the time. To put it in perspective, the only thing she was reading other than the Bible and the occasional books on football or dogs, because she was big on football, especially pro football, and big on dogs. She just loved dogs, loved all animals, but amazing her love for dogs. But besides those, she was reading C.S. Lewis, A.W. Tozer, John Piper, Tim Keller, Jerry Bridges, his books. Like just for instance, J.I. Packer's Knowing God. She was reading Knowing God. She was reading The Knowledge of the Holy. So that's by Packer, and Knowledge of the Holy by Tozer. She was reading Jerry Bridges' The Pursuit of God, and then John Piper's Desiring God. All of these books with God in the title and Jesus in the title. That was like I sat at her feet. I mean, it was like for a long time I was the spiritual leader, and of course, in a technical sense, yes, I was still her spiritual leader, but she was leading me spiritually through the quality of her life and her devotion to Jesus. And we would publish in I blog 3 times a week, and there was a period of years where I would often talk about her in my blog. And then after she died, many of my blogs related to her and what I learned from her, and quoting from her in her journal. Phenomenal, the impact she had on me, and in turn through my writing on countless other people and on her family. Oh my word. It was her kids and her grandkids and sons-in-law. Amazing.
Yeah. Wow. And I'm glad you shared that, because it's so interesting as you share that the relationship that you guys had, tremendous, first and foremost, but to watch someone go through a really challenging time and how it made an impact on you, and then the way that you've been able to impact others, how it tears into so many different things. And I'm really glad you shared that. First and foremost, too, I'd love for you to talk about your perspective on what it means to be a good husband and also a good father.
Yeah, I would say to be faithful to Jesus, to put Jesus first. C.S. Lewis talked about put first things first, and then second things that are second will fall into place. And that's what I think you need to do. Be strong in your walk with Jesus, and that will just spill over to being a husband, being a father. I don't mean that there's nothing else that you need to do. Of course, you need to focus on the things that are involved in being a husband and a father. But if you're not putting Jesus first, you will not be a good husband. You will not be a good father, no matter how many technique books you read. You will not be a good leader. You can read all the books in the world on leadership, and you probably have. I haven't, but but when you do, if you're not walking with Jesus, if he's not first in your life, then you're not going to be the kind of leader God wants you to be, and that carries over to being the husband, being the father. Now, the world I live in now is and being a grandfather, because my impact on me, I just came from a tennis match where one of my grandsons was there, and he's helped work with the team, and I coached him, and I coached his brother in tennis, and we so I would say having time for being there, simply being there. I'm talking now quantity of time. People talk about quality time. Well, some of the people who are talking about quality time really need to work on the quantity time, because if you're spending 10 minutes a day with your wife and 10 minutes a day with your kids, you can make it the highest quality time you can, but nothing's going to compensate for the fact that you're not there with them enough. So the best thing with quality time is first have the quantity time. Now let's make the quantity time quality time, but you don't have to be as uptight about it. Like, oh, we got to get this done. I got to read this to you. You've got to do this, because we are so limited in the time we have. So for me, being with my wife was doing things she loved to do, having time for her, not just doing things I like to do or things related to me and my ministry, although we did get a lot of wonderful trips at places she loved to go to. Like I remember when Operation Mobilization was asking me, would you come and would you speak at our fundraising thing, which I do often with different ministry groups. And I said, but you want to know where this one is? And she says, where? And I said, Jamaica. And yes. So again, we would do that. Been all over the world speaking related to ministry types of things. And sometimes the places we go were not fun places, but they were meaningful places to be. And other times they were fun places. So speaking on Maui, she was always up for that. Yeah. Come, and I'm tempted to fill in another example of places she didn't want to go, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to insult everybody who lives in North Dakota. Oh, whoops, I said it. Or okay. Whatever. North Dakota asking us to speak there in the winter.
Sure.
So summer, that might be a different, thing. So shouldn't have used that illustration, but hey, I did.
No,
my apologies to anybody in North Dakota, but I think they get it why winter would not be the time that you'd want to bring your wife there. But then kids, same thing, time with them. They were both involved in basketball when they were in grade school, but then volleyball, especially when they were in high school, and then tennis. And I coached both of them in tennis. That's when I started coaching, and then later coached guys after they graduated, which, was kind of the foundation of later under that same head coach that he would ask me to come back and coach my grandsons. So when you're coaching, you're having time. Now, it's not automatically quality time, but it is quantity time. So that's where you have to work on. And sometimes I would do this, say, okay, I think, why don't you, head coach, you coach my daughters, and I'll coach everybody else around them. We'll be in team meetings together. I'll be on the sidelines cheering for them. But sometimes coaching is a little overpowering. And so it's like, okay, my dad's my dad at home, and now he's coaching me. So I think there are people, and again, I work with pro athletes, and many of them have been coached by their dads. But at some point, they're no longer coached by their dads. And so it's like, and once you hand off that baton, stop coaching them.
Yes,
you're a coach, right? So
yes, sir. Yes, I am.
And you understand that, and I have no idea what you experienced with it, but yeah. So that's all related to family. Have time for them, quantity time, quality time. Talk about the Lord. Have time in the Word together. Pray together as a family. We did all that, and by God's grace, we weren't perfect by any means, but He did some great things in our family. Both girls love the Lord with all their hearts. Both girls married guys that love the Lord with all their heart. And that's one of the things I say is your job is not done. If I'm not going to assume every kid is going to ultimately get married. There are some people who are called to a lifetime of singleness, but the great majority will get married, and your job is not done with your kids until you have helped them make sure that when they're getting married, they're marrying the right guy. And by God's grace, that happened, and it's wonderful. And each of our grandsons knows the Lord, walking with Him. Never going to assume, though. People crash and burn, and I've been close to very solid people who had walked with the Lord, who have turned away from the Lord. And let's just keep praying for perseverance.
Yes. Well, I think those principles that you just shared for sure for the family, but also the source of making sure the source is primary
Right.
and then working backwards. I mean, you touched on it. I was thinking about this the other day. I can read all the leadership books in the world I want, but going back to what you shared about your wife, God was at the center of each of those books she was reading. Unfortunately, I got a little convicted. Like that's what matters most, right? And
Right.
because if I do
Absolutely.
that well, then everything will flow from that. So it
Right.
goes right into what you just shared. Well, real quickly, I've got a little fire round, so
All
I'll
right.
say a sentence or a word, and you can finish with a word or
Okay.
sentence, however you feel led. Humility means.
Humility means knowing it's not about you, it's about God, and it's about other people, and it's about genuinely putting yourself last, putting yourself second after God, third after other people. And that's humility. It's being like Jesus.
Awesome. Favorite vacation spot.
Maui.
Maui.
All
There
right.
we
We got
go.
that in there already. Yeah.
Love means.
Wow. Love means being giving of yourself for the good of another person and for their ultimate good, not just their immediate good. It's because
Mm,
sometimes it's going to be tough love and it's not going to look like love, but it is
yeah.
going to be love.
Well said. Well, do you have a favorite book besides your own books?
Uh, the Knowledge of the Holy, A.W. Tozer. That one stands above all others. Many thousands of books that I have read. I'm a compulsive reader, but that one still has an abiding nature to it. And probably of Lewis's books, probably The Problem of Pain is still very significant for me. And of Schaeffer's books, He Is There and He Is Not Silent. So one from each of my favorite
Hmm.
authors.
Awesome. We're done with the fire round. The final two questions I have for you, I'm going to change it up a little bit
Yeah.
because I do know you're a tennis coach and definitely kind of diving into what you just shared about coaching your kids, coaching the players that you've had. You know, that dynamic is very interesting when you have a father son. We just had Eric Musselman, who's now the USC coach, but his dad was a head coach. And so he talked about how important that was for him. They had a great relationship.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's not always the case. But I'd love to hear your perspective on coaching and what, in your opinion, do the best coaches have in common and what do they do well?
Yeah. Well, I just came from a tournament today where our head coach at Barlow High School, Andrew Pate is his name. He's a great teacher, and he is a great coach. And I would say he is affirming. He doesn't hesitate to say what somebody's doing wrong, but he always commends them for what they're doing well and believes in them. And it's never adversarial, even when correction is needed. It's never adversarial. It's calm. His demeanor is never accusatory. He doesn't raise his voice. For a coach to not raise his voice, as you know, that's not real common, because I mean, part of
Yeah,
it is you almost have to raise your voice sometimes to get somebody to hear you who's off,
sure,
but
sure.
not raise your voice in the sense that I mean in anger.
Yes.
And so that's a huge part of it, and believing in the person, and where they know you believe in them, and that you're there, win or lose. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Well said. Well, Randy, this podcast is called Building Excellence. What does building excellence mean to you?
I think excellence to me begins with faithfulness. Um, we are not always going to be the best at what we do, but we can always be as faithful as we can be. That is, as is within our power to be. But with excellence, some people go, okay, so I'm committed to excellence, which means I'm going to end up the winner in everything. Well, no, because we know if you should learn one thing in sports, it's that, like the pro football players that I work with, at the end of the year, only one team wins the Super Bowl, and half the players on that Super Bowl winning team never got into the game. And half the players that got into the game are disappointed because they missed a big tackle or they threw, a couple of interceptions, and yeah, they ended up winning, but they're still. And then it's NFL, not for long, not going to be around very long. And am I ever going to have this opportunity again? And it's almost like immediate discouragement, even when you have excelled to the max. You're the winner, and a few months later, you're in optional training activities in the spring, and you're going into summer camp, and you started a new season and you're battling an injury or whatever. So I think it's faithfulness. You've got to be faithful to the Lord, and uh, putting Him first and seeking to be excellent in being a child of God who listens to his Father's voice and does what the Lord tells him to do, and is a true friend to Jesus and receives the friendship of Jesus. All of those are the kind of excellence and humility that God really values.
Well said. Well, Randy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, for sharing your story, some of the principles in your books, the relationship with your wife, so many great concepts and principles that people can apply. If someone wanted to find out more, we'll obviously put these things in the show notes, but what's the best way to find you on social or via your website?
Yeah, epm.org, epm.org, and some people transpose the letters with that. I won't even say how they transpose them, lest
Okay.
somebody get that in their mind, but it is epm.org. And when you go there, you'll find a wealth of resources, pretty much everything I've ever written, and I've written more than any human being should write,
No.
probably, arguably, plus the 60 some books that you can get besides those. But sometimes you'll get excerpts from the books and development of those ideas. And then the social media information is there on that on the website as well.
Awesome. And we'll put those in the show notes. But just like you shared at the very end there, thank you also for your faithfulness on doing what God has called you to do and the impact that it's made because you've been faithful. So I just really
You're
appreciate that and
welcome,
wanted
Bailey.
to
Thanks for
share
what
that.
you
Yep.
do. Love
Yep.
what you've done, what I've seen of it, and God bless you as you continue to do it.